Okay, here we go. Hello, everybody. This is my second attempt at this. It was suggested to me that I should try this via Zoom, so I tried to connect the two, and there was a bit of feedback. So I'll work out the technical aspects of that later. But welcome to the Power Hour number 2. If you're here live, welcome. I just want to let people know that I'm here to just talk about whatever it is I plan to talk about, but I'm also quite happy to answer people's questions if they have questions. And if you want to submit a question in advance for me to have a look at and answer and try to give you some insight on, then I will do that. A few other bits of housekeeping. Thank you for your comments on the previous video. So what I've done is today I looked back over those comments and I decided to timestamp the various different parts of the video. So if you want to just skip to certain parts to find something that interests you, then it's going to make it easier for you to do that. And also where I've mentioned something or mentioned a different source, if you like. So for example, I reference a podcast that I make on Spotify. I put a link to that podcast episode in the comment where I mentioned it. And at the bottom, I also, towards the end of the podcast, calling it a podcast now, it's a Facebook Live, but I think we all know what I mean. I also referenced a TikTok page that I have, and I put a link to that page, but also a QR code that you can use. So just to make you aware that there's other pieces of content that I create on a regular basis. So I'm going to start in exactly the same way that I started last time, which is to ground myself and ground everybody in our wisdom. If you want to know a little bit more about that and the background, then feel free to look at the previous podcast because I described the 3 principles, how they originated and how grounding is part of the 3 principles. So today's reading is going to be from a book called Sweet Sharing by a 3 principles coach called Ankush Jain. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that book because it is quite important to me after I've read the little passage. I just read it before I came on live. I'm going to read it again. And there was a point, I say this every time, but there was a point at which I just exhaled because I know that I've gone from my thinking, my busy mind, my busy thoughts rather, into mind, which is a deeper level of awareness, a bit like mindfulness. Here we go. This chapter is interestingly titled, You Are Not Who You Think You Are. So I remember, last time we talked about this idea of not believing everything you think. Well, this is a whole chapter based around that idea. So this is Ankush writing. I used to think I was my personality. My identity was based on all of the thinking I was doing. If I had good thoughts, that made me a good person. If I had bad thoughts, that made me a bad person. I desperately wanted to be a good person. Deep down, all I really wanted was simply to be happy and loved. And because of this, I ended up spending a lot of my life pursuing things that I thought would make me happy. But what I didn't realize was that I was expending my energy on pursuits that wouldn't have the outcome I desired. I'd forgotten that as a very young boy, I was happy most of the time, and I ignored the time my father told me the proudest day of his life was the day I was born. And instead, I still looked for ways to gain his approval. I saw the world through the lens of my own thinking, as we all do, and I innocently looked in the wrong direction for my happiness. What I was eventually opened up to was the realization that, in fact, I'm not my thinking. Thoughts occur to me constantly. They are not who I am. As I've mentioned elsewhere in this book, I don't have a fixed personality. and neither do you. As I dropped this misunderstanding, my thinking stopped having such a hold on me. It was no longer imperative to have certain good thoughts, and I no longer needed to feel guilty about having bad thoughts. So, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this book, why it's important to me, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my journey through the three principles before we start. So I first came across the three principles probably about 3 years before I actually started using them, if you like. And I got involved with the principles through a rabbi that I knew who had opened a centre in London. And it was a kind of Jewish learning centre, but it was different in the sense that it focused on something that he described as innate health. So I remember going to a presentation on innate health and the three principles. And I sat there and sounded interesting, sounded all right. When I look back on it now, I was approaching the principles through my thinking, through mind. And when I started thinking and analysing, which was what I was used to doing, I really didn't see the value in them at all. Anyway, I had a conversation with somebody who was there, and this person was talking about, oh, there's a training course you can do if you're interested in the principles, maybe becoming a practitioner, if that appeals to you. And so I said to her, how much does it cost? I said, okay, it sounds interesting. And she said, oh, it's £6,000. And this must have been like 2017, 2018. I mean, that's still a lot of money now. And I remember thinking, that's £2,000 per principle. And I've just been listening to this presentation where they've been telling me these things are really easy, they're really straightforward, they're really simple to explain to people. So that didn't really make any sense to me at all. And I didn't really think about three principles again. I started going to that centre because they offered some great programming in general. Anyone who went to Tikkun in the noughties, the early noughties, might remember what fabulous programming they had. Anyway, I didn't really think about the principles again until I'm going to say 2018, something like that. And I was in a job. I'm not going to describe what the job was. I'm not going to give any details, but I was in a very stressful job. And basically, I had got to the point where I literally could not handle the amount of stress that I was under because I was in a different situation to the kind of situation I've normally been in, and I was exposed to sort of a level of stress that I'd never experienced before either. And what that made me do is it made me open my eyes and look around for something new, because I had certain techniques or certain resources that I would normally go to help me deal with difficult situations. This situation was something completely different. I honestly did not know how to handle the situation that I was in. So I opened my eyes, I started looking around. And I remember one day I was on YouTube, and I found the exact moment in this clip. So I was watching a clip, and it was three principles. Oh, I know what the three principles are. Okay, I don't know, I'll watch it. So what it was an interview between another rabbi, funnily enough, in the US. And he was interviewing a three principles practitioner called Mark Howard, wonderful three principles practitioner. And there was something about Mark, he just had a really, really calm energy about him. He just started, speaking very, very calmly about mind, about wisdom, about thought, and about consciousness. And he had his own. He was a psychiatrist, so he had his own practice. Can't remember where exactly he lived in the US. Had his own practice, and like a lot of people who came to the principles, who came from that field of psychiatry, he he started working with his clients with the principles without necessarily telling them that's what he was doing. He just decided to bring some of that into his work. And he had an interaction with one client, and as I say in the comments below, I'm going to give you the exact point at which he mentions this. Not this is necessarily going to have the same impact on you, but this 1 or 2 minutes of video changed my life. So what happened in the video is that he reported a conversation that he had with one of his clients. Now, in the last video last week, I talked about the conversation that Sid Banks had with somebody that was the prompt for him to have a huge insight in his life. And this was the overheard conversation that got me to have my first insight. So Mark Howard was talking to a client. He'd been talking about the role of thought. The client was having a problem. I can't even remember what the problem was the client was having. And he came to Mark, came back into a session sort of a week after having seen him. And he said to him, you know what, Mark, what I've realized is I don't have to think those thoughts anymore. Those negative thoughts that I had, I don't have to think them. Now, that's a fairly innocuous kind of statement, but for me, I somehow dropped from my own thinking and my own consciousness deep into mind. And I suddenly became aware, possibly for the first time in my life, that actually I was a thinking being and I was living my life via my thinking, which is really quite a strange realization to have. But like a lot of things with the principles, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So that was my first insight. And I remember I watched this video and then I was driving around. I know exactly where I was in North London. I was driving my car and all these thoughts were going through my head. And I was saying to myself, that's a thought. That's another thought. Oh, look, there's another thought there. So I started counting my thoughts. And when that gap had opened up between me and my thinking, I was never the same person again. So what that allowed me to do is to take all of the incredibly stressful thoughts that I was having in this work situation, not so much manage them, but just understand that they were just thoughts. And I can't explain to you what a calming effect that had on me, and it allowed me to get through that period of real stress. Now, it was probably about a year after that I discovered this book, Sweet Sharing, that I just read an extract from. And at that point, I had gone out the frying pan into the fire, into a possibly even more stressful job, but back in teaching. And what I used to do before I went into class was I would sit down with that book and I would read a couple of chapters before I went into my lesson. And I found I was able to cope so much more easily with the external stuff that I was getting from the kids, And that was a real game changer for me. That it was after that moment that I realized, okay, this is something really important, and this is something that I want to bring into my coaching work as well. And ever since then, I've brought it in. I started working with a 3 principles coach. I joined a group during lockdown, I think, called Wisdom Entrepreneurs, which was fantastic. And also, we used to start with a reading. We would sort of ground ourselves in mind, and then we would be able to discuss whatever the topic was that we were discussing. So that brings me on to today's topic. Before I get there, though, I've just got to throw in a little something into the mix. I think I mentioned last time I started working with a new coach, Jain, and we've been having conversations about what I would call divine providence and what she might call magical living. But really what I'm talking about are things that seem to be coincidences, that on reflection are not necessarily coincidences, but they're things that you're being shown. So I had one of those today. This has been happening a lot. One of the stories I'm going to tell later on is of another one of those things that I've had this week. these things seem to, these little happy accidents have been coming more and more regularly for me this particular week. And just before I went on today, I was looking back, I had a comment on one of my posts this week. And the comment was from a good friend of mine, Jan Levin. Now, anyone who knows me from London and knows me from Muswell Hill will know Jan Levin. And she sent me a lovely comment. I'm not going to say anything more about what the comment was, other than to tell you that she's an 88-year-old lady who lives on the south coast. And the reason that I want to reference her is because I became very close with Jan and her late husband, Eddie, when I first joined Muswell Hill. And I wrote an article on my Medium blog, which I'm going to post. This was a few years ago, called You Can Choose Your Parents. So this is the first part of the subject matter for today. It's about parents and children. This is the thing, right? But it's a different take on parents and children. So, as I said, Jan and Eddie were like surrogate parents for me. My parents were still alive at this point when I first met them. But the point I was trying to make is that we feel that our parents are our parents and our families are our families. And in some way, we are, our personality is formed and our lives are determined through things like our family position, through things like our relationship with our parents, their strengths, their weaknesses, how they viewed us, how they treated us, birth position, all this kind of stuff. The point I was trying to make in that article as a result of having been parented in a way, not just by Jan and Eddie, but by other amazing people in my community, is that there is something about honoring that relationship that we have with people who are older than ourselves, particularly in the Jewish community, but I'm sure it applies elsewhere. There is an amazing growth opportunity. That's really what I want to talk about. It wasn't just that particular couple, but there are other people who are still in my life now who have who've acted like parents. Yeah, that's really all I can say, and it's a blessing, to be able to have the relationship I had with my parents when they got sick, before they got sick, when they got sick, and going through that process of caring for other people when they need you, when they're ill. I think made me a more compassionate and understanding person, so that when I encountered that life life stages with other people, I kind of knew what I needed to do and how I needed to deal with it, and it wasn't so overwhelming for me as it had been when I first had to go through, for example, grief and mourning and this kind of stuff. So that's the first part of the jigsaw, and I really only bring that up because it just ties in so nicely with the second part, which is, and I kind of name this part, bringing your inner child to work, bringing your inner child to work day. Okay, so yeah, I had a conversation during the week with another friend of mine from Muswell Hill. You'll probably be watching this on the replay, and she was relaying to me a course that she was doing. Similar kind of, we do similar kind of work. We've worked together in the past, and obviously we kind of compare notes. And the course that she was doing, also for coaches, entrepreneurs, was based in this idea of your inner child and befriending your inner child, bringing your inner child to work, and understanding what that means in a journey towards self-employment, shall we say. So I hear this quite a lot, and it sounds a little bit like a cliche, but one of the things you really hear quite often is you've got to learn to get out of your own way, but no one actually tells you what that means. So here's something that I've kind of discovered about what that means. it has really helped me ever since I've had that conversation. In fact, it sounded a bit woo-woo at the time, a little bit like my reaction to the principles when I first heard about them. I just processed it intellectually, and I just thought, yeah, I've heard that before. Okay, inner child, parent your inner child, blah, blah, blah. But actually, I sat down and did some reflection on it, did some journaling on it, and I'll share this because I found it really powerful but quite difficult to do. I created this sort of process that I call shame dumping. And all I did was I wrote a number of sentences. Obviously, I'm not going to share what I wrote, and it doesn't really matter what I wrote. What matters more is what you choose to write if you choose to do this. So I had a little sentence starter for each sentence. And the sentence starter was, I'm ashamed of, right? And I used that, I don't know, I spontaneously came across that, I came upon that idea. I used that idea to get in touch with my inner 8-year-old, really. All the things that I'd done in my life that I wasn't proud of, the things I did in my life that I think came from a deeper part of me that was maybe, I don't know, unhealed or whatever you want to call it. But I came up with a list. It wasn't really fun. It wasn't a particularly fun exercise, but it was very useful. So I came up with a list of things, and I became aware of how I was feeling at the time. It made me feel like a victim. It really did make me feel like a victim. So the second part of the training that my friend was doing was about how you then take that inner child, that vulnerable 8-year-old that you're carrying around with you all the time, and you have no idea you're carrying it around with you. You're bringing it to work every day without you realizing how you parent that child, because we can parent those children. How you do it is then you start thinking about, well, what are the resources that I have as an adult, right? How am I able to take the weakness and the vulnerability and the things I'm not happy about, the things I wish I hadn't done, and then bring my resources as an adult to reassure that inner child that it's okay. Okay, things are going to be all right. You can put yourself out there in the world. You can communicate with people because you have the resources now as an adult to do that. So I'm actually going to give you an example and how I use this example to create one of my first businesses. So, as I mentioned last time, I spent 30 years teaching in high schools in London. And the first part of my teaching career was in East London, and I worked in some pretty demanding schools. I'm not going to lie, they were difficult schools, difficult kids. But at that point in time, I was a younger man, I had plenty of energy, I wanted to, change the world and inspire young people. Hopefully, I managed to do that. But one of the problems that I had was that I was really ill equipped to do that, personality wise, um, because I didn't really have the skills within me to make large groups of 12-year-olds listen to me and do what I said. So I was teaching drama at the time. Very, very difficult subject to teach at the best of times. You've got to have a very strong personality. You've got to be very good at controlling people and getting them to do exactly what you say, exactly when you say it, in order to get the kind of result you want. That wasn't the kind of person that I was. And so I literally had to put myself through an assertiveness training course. That's one of the first things I did. I used my own sort of acting technique skills to sort of fake it till I made it. And then in the end, I started to teach that to beginning teachers as a way of helping them, who starting off with exactly the same problems that I had, helping them to become more effective as classroom teachers. So in a way, you can argue, I was bringing my inner child to work and I wasn't even aware of it, but I was taking my adult self and I was finding the resources that I needed to go and parent that inner child and help them to use their strengths. So my strengths at the time were creating rapport, teaching drama, being very passionate about drama and theatre, but not having that kind of assertiveness or barriers or boundaries, and then learning that as an adult, putting that on top in order to protect myself from these mad kids that I was teaching. So that's kind of like, that's 25 minutes worth of full circle, really. So I started off talking about being able to choose your parents and choosing your own parenting from the people around you, people that can provide things that perhaps your parents weren't able to do because parents are people and everyone has their own limitations. And then I moved that onto the idea of bringing your inner child into business and parenting your inner child. Um, so it's an interesting way of looking at being a parent and being a child from a slightly different sort of perspective. So do excuse me while I check my notes for what I decided I wanted to talk about for the rest of it. Now, yeah, I talked about shame dumping. Okay. Oh, yes. I'm just going to move on a little bit, seeing as we're talking about weaknesses, things we might be ashamed of in our life. I was talking about this list, this shame dump that I made. I'm ashamed of this, I'm ashamed of that, and I found that quite cathartic because it helped me to isolate the things where I was feeling a victim in my life and then move forward. One other piece of content that I want to share is something that I came across, which is a psychological theory. And it's the theory of the big five personality traits. Now, I think these are fairly well known, but the acronym for them is OCEAN. Okay? So the big five traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, I didn't go through some test to try and work out which one I was. I simply heard somebody talk about this and recognized myself straight away. So one of the things that, the main personality trait from that big five for me is agreeableness. So when I came across this, I was listening to a lecture and I heard the lecturer say something very interesting. To sort of paraphrase what he said, agreeableness is basically a double-edged sword because it's a positive and a negative. The positive is that people like you. The negative is that you need people to like you. And he actually said, a lot of the time, agreeable people don't actually know what they want because they spend most of their time worrying about what other people want. So they tend to subsume a lot of their needs. And this was like light bulb moment for me. Absolute light bulb moment for me. I realized, okay, that is so true. So doing a little bit more inner child work as I was doing this week, I was thinking, in what way do I spend more time worrying about what other people think? In what way do I not really know what I want out of life because I'm too busy worrying about what other people want? And I realized that if you spend a lot of your life as a people pleaser, then you will be ultimately concerned with the way that you are perceived by other people. And if you want to be successful in any area of your life, particularly something like business, you can't really afford for that to be the case for a number of different reasons. So firstly, not knowing what you want because you're worried about what other people want is a problem for everybody, because what you end up doing is creating a false self, somebody who just wants to please others. Some people call it disease to please. So you have to kind of think very carefully about who you're allowing into your life and who you're allowing to interact with you, and whether you're allowing people to interact with you because you actually want to be around those people, or whether you want to interact with those people because you want to be seen as a good person. That's a very, very difficult call to make. And again, you have to look deep inside yourself and come to some kind of conclusion about that. Not an easy one, but ultimately it's well worth doing. Knowing which of those big five personality traits you are, understanding how, what the best way to deal with them, and starting to become a little bit more boundaried in how you communicate, who you communicate with, that kind of thing. So that was something I definitely wanted to cover. Now, I spent quite a lot of time last week talking about how you choose to work with people and doing that based on what your values are and becoming aware of your values. So I talked about John Street, and he was one of the first people to encourage me to write down my values. So in this session, I've already encouraged people to write down a bit of a shame dump I'm ashamed of. And another thing you can do, another kind of exercise that you can do, which I found really useful, is to make a list of your values. So I'm happy to share them here. I started off with 10, they added a couple more. I'm not going to talk about the ones I talked about last week. So I talked about integrity, accountability, openness. So for me, flexible working is a big value of mine, and self-employment is a big value of mine. Originality. When I found a way of solving this problem about keeping discipline in class, as I spoke about, I had an insight, a number of insights which helped me do this. I'll just describe them briefly for you. One day, I was teaching my A-level class how to act, and I was talking about the Stanislavski system, which is all about how you fake it till you make it. It's all about how you get an audience to believe that you are who you say you are. And in order to demonstrate this, I showed them a video. If you've never watched this, I highly recommend it. This is an amazing video. I think you can probably still find it on YouTube. There used to be a series on Channel 4 called Faking It. I don't know if you remember this. Late 90s, early noughties. And there was an episode called Alex the Animal. And this basically is a series about transformation. So people fake it and they pretend to be almost the complete opposite of themselves. And then they set a challenge for other people to work out who the faker is. So this particular one, Alex, he's 5'6". He's quite a posh boy, brought up in the country, I think in Norfolk. He's a Cambridge University student and he's gay. And his transformation was to become a kickboxing bouncer, nightclub bouncer from South London. And to have somebody who worked with bouncers every day not be able to tell the difference between the real bouncers who were applying for a job and Alex the faker. About 45 minutes long. It showed him talking to, being coached by acting teachers, being coached by other bouncers, being coached by all sorts of people, and he did it. He did it. He faked it, and he was this guy. I remember looking at the interview afterwards. There were about 6 people applying for a job. It was where the Hippodrome is now, which is now, I think the Hippodrome is now a casino, but when it was a nightclub, there was a chief bouncer there. There was a guy looking at all these guys, trying to work out who the faker was. And he said, it's definitely that guy, isn't it? It wasn't him. And when they told him it was Alex, the look on his face was unbelievable. He was like, no, I don't believe it. So Alex had done such a good job of faking it that he'd passed the test. Now, I've been showing this to my drama students, talking to them about acting, faking it till you make it, this kind of thing. And in the next lesson, or the lesson after, I was doing an observation. So it just so happened I was observing a young teacher who was struggling with classroom discipline. Okay, fine, I was making notes on what was going on. And I had this insight, this understanding. Oh my goodness. This guy, the kids don't believe that he is who he says he is. That's why he's having problems. And suddenly light bulb went off in my brain and I just thought, I need to teach him how to act. So creativity, this is what I'm talking about. One of my values is bringing in ideas from seemingly unrelated fields to a seemingly unresolvable problem. So a lot of what I did in my coaching of teachers was to teach acting technique, various different things. With the mindful eating project that I started talking about last week, what I did was I applied the 3 principles to the process of eating. And I had insights, amazing insights really about dieting, about health, about my innate health. And I never would have had those had I not brought in this seemingly unrelated information, in the same way that I brought in the seemingly unrelated information about class and discipline. So creativity is another one. Let's see how many we do in terms of time. Sorry, creativity and originality. Okay. Being of service. What am I doing here? I'm being of service. Am I asking anything in return? No, I'm not. I believe that it's very important, if you're going to lead, if you're going to put yourself out there, to demonstrate to people that you have some value and you have something to offer. And I think if you do that, you stand out. Why is that? Because an awful lot of people will go straight into, why don't you buy this? Why don't you pay for this? What, And one of the things I learned from John Street is that it doesn't actually work long term. What you have to really think about doing is putting yourself out there and being prepared to provide value on a consistent basis to people before you ask for anything, which is why I'm not even thinking about asking for anything. In fact, I'm probably going to make some more offers in the next few videos for some free coaching slots. But other than that, that's my only plan. Okay, more values. Being of service. Oh, sorry. I also feel that there's some part of that which is to do with rapport. So one of the skills that I used to teach teachers, and one of the skills that I learned, and I'm happy to share this here, is probably the most useful NLP skill that I learned in my whole exposure to NLP. Started off by coaching NLP, and then I moved on to the principles. And that is the idea of pacing and leading. What is pacing and leading? Think of it as a dance. Pace, 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 lead. You pace 3 times before you try and lead. So here's the example. Which of these 2 department stores would you rather go into? Would you rather go into a shop where the guy behind the counter comes right up to you and says, "Sir, it's lovely to see you. I'm so glad you're here. I want to show you this is on sale and this is on sale and we got this and we got this." That's version 1. Or would you rather go into a shop where the person behind the counter acknowledges you and then allows you to browse, see what it is you like, and then maybe starts a conversation with you or waits for you to come to them? So most people say the latter. But why is that? It's because that second person has created, without you realizing, has created some level of rapport with you. And this is what I tend to find on an ongoing basis, is where people don't bother creating rapport and go straight for leading. They want to lead you towards a purchase. They want to lead you to what? It's very off-putting. And it's off-putting because you haven't bothered to create rapport, probably because you don't know what it is. So that comes for me under being of service. Objectivity is another one of mine. So for example, do I believe everything that I think? Can I be self-critical as a coach, as an entrepreneur? Honesty, do I tell the truth? And then reliability, do I follow through and do I keep my promises? So those are some of the ones that I didn't mention last time. There is one more thing I want to do before I leave you today, and that is just tell you a quick story. I know we're 38 minutes in, so if you've been here the whole time, well done, even if it's on replay. I want to tell you a story about accountability. It's something I started talking about last week. And it also relates to the idea of happy coincidences, etc., etc. So as I think I mentioned, I'm working with a client at the moment on with a mindful eating project. And this client, in all honesty, has not gotten the result that they're looking for. So I've got 2 choices as a coach. I can either not take accountability and responsibility, or I can take accountability and responsibility. And so for me to not do that, I would simply say to that client, well, there we go. You weren't consistent. That's your problem. See you later. For me to take accountability and responsibility, I would have to think to myself, okay, have I done absolutely everything I can as a coach to get you the result you want? Am I worth the money that I'm charging you? Right? There's a podcast episode I made about that today, which I'll link as well. And so what I did was I took responsibility. I wasn't really looking forward to our session, but I was going to have an accountability session. And then my coach, Jain, if you're watching, sent me an amazing audio at literally the right time before this session. And it's an audio by an amazing coach called Steve Chandler. I've actually heard this audio before, but again, sometimes you need to hear things at the right time. It is called Expectation versus Agreement. And very simply, the problem that I had and the problem that my client had was that we both had expectations of what was going to happen. And we were both disappointed in the other person that they didn't fulfill their expectations. And what Steve Chandler says is, you know what? Nobody likes expectations. People really resent people who have expectations of them. But people love agreements, and they will go over and above to keep to an agreement that they've made that is a win-win, that they've bought into, that the other person has bought into. So I heard that exactly the right time. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to sit there with my client. I'm going to explain the difference between expectation and agreement, and I'm going to make an agreement with her and get her on board, and that's what we've done. And it's working, right? So we created a really, really tight agreement to help her to become more consistent. And I realized as a coach, there is something more that I could do, and that was the thing that I added in. Whew. Okay, that's about 40 minutes. I think that's pretty good going. I know I'm calling this a power hour, but today it's a 42-minute power hour. So the one request that I do have actually is that if you did find this of value and you don't mind sharing it on your Facebook page, that would make me very appreciative, because simply said, it'd just be nice if more people got to appreciate some of the value. So thanks again for listening. If you've been here live or if you're on the replay, have a great week, and I'll speak to you same time next week.